The morning sun rose over the plains of Apulia, hot and merciless. Dust shimmered above the fields, stirred by the marching of 80,000 Roman soldiers, the might of the Republic itself. Shields clanged, horses snorted, standards glimmered in the light of dawn. They were confident, invincible. 4 generations, Rome had crushed every enemy that dared stand against her. But today, they were walking into the jaws of a genius. It was the summer of 216 BC. Rome had endured 2 years of humiliation. A Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca, the man who had crossed the Alps with elephants and fury, had crushed every Roman army sent against him. But the Senate would not yield. They summoned the largest army Rome had ever fielded. They would drown Hannibal in numbers, crush him beneath Roman discipline, and finally end the nightmare that had haunted Italy. That was the plan. But Hannibal had another. He stood on a small rise overlooking the dusty plain near a town called Cannae. The wind tugged at his cloak, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and river reeds. In the distance, he could see the Roman legions forming their lines, a sea of red shields, sunlight flashing from helmets, a roar of discipline and pride. Hannibal's army was smaller, only about 40,000 men, but it was forged in blood and fire. Veterans from Spain, fierce Gauls from the north, disciplined Africans, and swift Numidian cavalry from the deserts of Africa. They spoke different tongues, worshipped different gods, but all obeyed Hannibal. He had chosen this battlefield with a predator's precision. The plains of Cannae were narrow, hemmed in by the river Aufidus to the north and low hills to the south. There would be no space to retreat, no room for confusion. It was a killing ground, designed for one thing, to trap an enemy. As the first light spilled across the plain, Hannibal looked toward his officers, Hasdrubal, Mago, Mahabal, men who had fought beside him since Spain. He said only this: "Today, we will show Rome the price of arrogance." The Romans advanced in silence, a living wall of shields and spears. Their standards gleamed, their faces grim. They believed Hannibal was cornered at last, exhausted, outnumbered, desperate. The consuls divided command. Paulus would lead one wing, Varro the other. The plan was simple: crush Hannibal's center with overwhelming force. It was the Roman way: direct, relentless, inevitable. As the drums rolled and the horns bellowed, 80,000 men began to march, step by thunderous step. The ground shook beneath them. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. On the other side, Hannibal's lines began to move, slowly, deliberately. The Gauls in the center advanced first, yelling their savage cries. The Spaniards beside them raised curved blades and shields of leather. Behind them, the Africans, calm, disciplined, silent, waited. Hannibal's formation was strange, a crescent, its center protruding toward the Romans. It looked like weakness, like an open wound waiting to be crushed. It was not. It was the bait. The Romans surged forward. Their commanders shouted orders. Close ranks. Press forward. Break them. The first impact was like a storm of metal. Swords clashed, shields locked, men screamed. The Roman front slammed into the Carthaginian center, and the crescent began to bend backward, step by step, exactly as Hannibal wanted. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding. The sun burned hot and merciless overhead. But the Romans saw only what they wanted to see: the enemy falling back. To them, it was victory. Push forward. Varro bellowed, raising his sword. The day is ours. Tens of thousands obeyed. The Roman mass pressed deeper and deeper into Hannibal's center, compressing itself tighter and tighter, a human tide flooding into the trap. But battles are not won by numbers. They are won by the mind. Hannibal's center bent like a bowstring. And then, he released it. From both flanks, his African infantry, disciplined veterans in captured Roman armor, pivoted inward. From the rear, his cavalry, having smashed the Roman horsemen in minutes, circled back and struck from behind. In a single, perfect movement, Hannibal closed the circle. The Romans, who had moments ago believed they were winning, suddenly realized they were surrounded. Front, sides, and rear. The battlefield had become a cage. Panic rippled through the ranks, but there was no escape. Men shouted. Trumpets blared conflicting orders. The formations collapsed into chaos. Then came the killing. They fought like trapped animals. Those in front were cut down by Carthaginian blades. Those behind were crushed by the press of bodies. The wounded suffocated under the weight of their comrades. Men screamed for water, for air, for mercy, but there was none. The sun climbed higher, baking the plain. The dust turned to mud, soaked with blood. A Roman soldier later wrote, "The earth itself drank us." Hour after hour, the slaughter continued. The Romans fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing. They could not see their enemy, could not move their arms freely, could not hear their officers over the roar of death. The legion, that machine of discipline, became a heaving, dying mass. Imagine 80,000 men packed into a space no larger than a village. Imagine the smell of blood, the heat of bodies pressed together, the sound of men dying without ever seeing who killed them. That was Cannae. Hannibal rode among his troops as the circle tightened. He gave few orders now. The plan was perfect. His men knew what to do. Around him, the ground was carpeted with corpses, Roman and Carthaginian alike, but the red tunics were everywhere. The river Aufidus ran dark that day. Even the wind seemed to carry the stench of death. By afternoon, the Romans no longer fought, they simply died. Groups of men tried to break out, only to be cut down by the Africans or trampled by their own. Some threw away their weapons and begged for mercy. Others fell on their swords. And still, the killing went on. As dusk approached, the sounds of battle faded into silence. The crows descended. Hannibal stood among the ruins of the Roman army, his armor dented, his face expressionless. Around him lay 50,000 Roman dead, another 10,000 captured, and countless wounded who would never rise again. The greatest army of the Republic, gone in a single day. That night, the wind blew cold. Fires burned across the plain, lighting the smoke and mist. Hannibal walked through the battlefield, stepping over bodies, hearing the faint groans of dying men. He had won the greatest victory of his life. But even he could not look upon the field without feeling the weight of what he had done. Crows gathered on spears. Wolves crept in from the hills. The air was thick with silence, the silence that follows the end of hope. The Battle of Cannae became a whisper that haunted Rome for generations. 50,000 Romans lay dead. Entire families wiped from existence. Of the senators' sons who fought that day, few returned. The Republic bled, but it did not die. For in that defeat, Rome would find the strength to rise again. The survivors stumbled back to Rome, their armor broken, their eyes hollow. When the city heard the news, there was panic, wailing in the streets, prayers in the temples, the Senate in chaos. Some said Hannibal would march on Rome itself. He did not. He waited, knowing that fear was his greatest weapon. And in that fear, the legend of Hannibal Barca was born. He had achieved the impossible. With half the numbers, he had destroyed the greatest army in the world. His tactics, the double envelopment, would be studied for centuries, taught in military academies from Prussia to West Point. But that day, on the plains of Apulia, no one thought of strategy or glory, only of the dead. They called it the bloodiest day in Roman history, a day when courage met genius, and courage lost. The fields of Cannae drank the blood of 50,000 sons of Rome. And as the sun set over the silent plain, even the gods must have turned away. The night after Cannae was silent. The moon rose pale over a field of ghosts. What had once been an army, 80,000 strong, now lay motionless beneath the stars. The wind carried the smell of iron and ash. Fires flickered among the dead as Carthaginian soldiers searched for survivors, weapons, anything of value. And through it all, Hannibal rode alone. His horse stepped carefully among the corpses, hooves splashing in puddles of blood. He stopped often, not to celebrate, but to stare, to think, to remember. He had done what no general before him had dared even to dream. He had annihilated the Roman army. They say Hannibal was born for war. But war, too, was born for men like him. He understood the field as a poet understands words, each movement, each formation, a verse in a terrible masterpiece. Days before the battle, Hannibal had studied the land with a hunter's patience. He knew the Roman way, the straight line, the direct assault, the unbreakable wall of discipline. But discipline can become blindness. He knew Rome would come for him with overwhelming force. So he prepared not to resist, but to absorb. He placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and Iberians, in the center, knowing they would give ground. His strongest, the Africans, drilled in Roman tactics and armed with captured Roman weapons, held the wings. The cavalry, his real weapon, he split into two blades, heavy cavalry on the left, swift Numidians on the right. The plan was elegant. He would let the Romans believe they were winning. He would let them press forward, deeper and deeper, until they could no longer move. Then he would close the jaws. And when the jaws closed, the world would remember his name. On the morning of the battle, he had turned to his officers. The wind carried the dust of the Roman advance. Tens of thousands of red shields shimmered in the sunlight. He said nothing for a long time, just watched. Then, softly, he murmured, "They are already dead. They just don't know it yet." As the dawn became day, his plan unfolded with terrifying precision. The Romans, confident and unyielding, slammed into his center. The Gauls fell back, not in panic, but by design. Every step backward drew the Romans deeper into the crescent. Every heartbeat brought them closer to the trap. When the moment came, Hannibal raised his hand. The African veterans pivoted. The cavalry swept behind the Roman ranks. The circle closed. What followed was not battle, it was slaughter. It was art made of blood, the perfect destruction. In that single maneuver, Hannibal changed the meaning of warfare. He showed that victory was not in numbers, but in the mind. He proved that genius could crush power, and that arrogance is the truest enemy of all. But victory, like all great things, came at a cost. Hannibal's army was exhausted. He had lost thousands of his best men. The battlefield, though his triumph, was also his burden. As dawn rose the next day, his officers urged him to march on Rome itself. The road was open. The city lay in panic. His cavalry commander, Mahabal, said to him, "Give me 5,000 horsemen, and in 5 days I will dine in the Senate of Rome." Hannibal looked at him quietly and replied, "You know how to win a battle, Mahabal, but not how to use one." It was a sentence history would never forget, for in those words lay the one decision that would haunt him forever. Hannibal had won the greatest victory in ancient history, but even he, the master of traps, could not escape time itself. Cannae was a triumph of the mind, but Rome's true weapon was the soul of its people. Back in Rome, news of the disaster arrived like a thunderclap. Messengers galloped through the city gates, covered in dust and blood. At first, no one believed them. 50,000 dead? Impossible. Rome had never lost like that. But then the truth came, name by name, son by son. Entire families extinguished. Noble houses reduced to ashes. The Senate fell into chaos. Mothers filled the streets, wailing for sons who would never return. Temples overflowed with offerings. The air of the eternal city was filled with fear. And yet, Rome did not fall. While others despaired, one man, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, the delayer, rose to speak. He had long warned the Senate that Hannibal could not be beaten by force, only by patience. Now, as panic spread, his words found their echo. "Rome still stands," he said. "While we live, the Republic lives. We will not fight his way. We will fight time." And so began the long war of endurance, the war Rome would eventually win. But in 216 BC, the shadow of Cannae stretched far and wide. All of southern Italy trembled. Cities that had sworn loyalty to Rome turned to Hannibal, believing the Republic doomed. From Capua to Tarentum, the people opened their gates to him. Even some Greek cities in Sicily whispered the Carthaginians' name as a savior. Hannibal became a legend, a man whose brilliance defied empires. He walked through the lands of Italy like a ghost of vengeance, his enemies trembling before him. And yet, he knew, the one enemy that mattered most had not fallen. Rome still breathed. Rome still waited. Genius can win 1,000 battles. But against will, the will to endure, to rebuild, to rise from ashes, genius alone is not enough. Years later, Roman generals would study Cannae in detail. They would spread sand across tables, placing stones to mark legions and cavalry, tracing the perfect circle that destroyed an army. They would whisper in or at the simplicity, the beauty, the horror of it. For Cannae became more than a battle. It became a lesson, in strategy, in arrogance, in fate. Even centuries later, military minds would bow before it. Frederick the Great studied it. Napoleon admired it. Schlieffen based his plans for world war upon it. And still, none would ever match it. Because Cannae was not just a tactic. It was prophecy. The fields of Cannae were soaked not only with blood, but with truth, the truth that every empire must learn. Pride blinds. Discipline without thought is weakness. And the greatest enemy of power is always itself. As months passed, Hannibal lingered in southern Italy. He had no siege equipment to take Rome. His army was weary, his supply lines stretched thin, and Carthage, his homeland, refused to send reinforcements. They did not understand what he had accomplished. They did not see that he had shattered Rome's body, but not yet its heart. So Hannibal waited. And as he waited, Rome began to recover. New legions were raised. New commanders emerged, men who had seen Cannae and vowed never to repeat it. Among them was a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would one day face Hannibal on another field, at Zama. But that was still years away. For now, the ghosts of Cannae lingered. At night, Roman farmers in Apulia said the ground still bled when it rained. They said the cries of dying men echoed in the wind. And when the moon rose, they swore they could see the shapes of soldiers still locked in eternal combat, Romans and Carthaginians frozen in time, their battle never truly ending. History, after all, never forgets blood. Cannae was not just the bloodiest battle of Rome, it was a mirror. In it, Rome saw its weakness, its hubris, its mortality. But from that mirror, Rome learned, and Rome endured. Hannibal had broken the body of the Republic, but he had forged its soul. The plains of Cannae lay quiet now, haunted by the ghosts of the fallen. For weeks, the bodies had rotted under the sun and rain. The river Aufidus ran thick with blood and mud, a grim testament to the genius of Hannibal and the fragility of the Roman Republic. Yet Rome did not fall. In the Senate, fear and fury mingled like fire and smoke. The city teetered on the brink of despair, but its leaders, those who survived the panic, made a choice: resilience over surrender. Quintus Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, advised caution. He knew Rome could not match Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he proposed a war of attrition, a slow, relentless pressure that would deny Hannibal the victories he sought. The Senate hesitated, divided between panic and stubborn pride, but Fabius' wisdom prevailed. Rome rebuilt its legions. The coffers emptied. New soldiers were raised from every town, every province, every surviving household. The cries of mothers and widows became fuel for determination, not despair. Rome's strength was not in its swords or shields, but in its heart. While Hannibal celebrated, Rome was reborn. The Republic learned to endure, to plan, and to strike not with fury, but with patience. Meanwhile, Hannibal roamed southern Italy. Victory had not changed him. He treated the survivors of Cannae with discipline. The Carthaginian army remained a model of order, but the weight of occupation was heavy. Supplies dwindled. Cities grew wary. Some welcomed him as a liberator, others resisted quietly, biding their time. Hannibal's mind, ever sharp, did not waver. He knew Rome was wounded. He believed it could be crushed, if only he could strike the right blow at the right time. Yet, the Republic was learning. Rome avoided open battle, refusing Hannibal the chance to repeat Cannae. The young commanders, inspired by losses, studied his tactics, imagining ways to counter them. Hannibal had trapped Rome once, but Rome had learned to walk through shadows without panic, to move through fire without burning. The countryside bore witness to a slow war. Hannibal attempted to take Capua, then Tarentum. Sieges dragged on. Soldiers suffered from disease, hunger, and fatigue. Even a general as brilliant as Hannibal could not conquer hearts as easily as he could armies. From the walls of Rome, new leaders emerged. Among them, a young Publius Cornelius Scipio distinguished himself. He watched Hannibal's campaigns with fascination and fear, memorizing each maneuver, noting every weakness. He understood that Rome's survival depended not only on courage but on study, innovation, and endurance. The months turned into years. Hannibal's campaigns were devastating but costly. Each victory came at a price. His army could not be replenished easily. The Republic, despite its trauma, refused to be broken. In these years, Rome developed a strategy of shadow and patience. They avoided Cannae-like encounters. They harassed Hannibal's supply lines, cut off reinforcements, and forced him into a slow, exhausting war. Cannae had shown the world the genius of one man, but it had also revealed the resilience of a nation. For every field Hannibal conquered, Rome planted seeds of survival, waiting for the day they could strike back. By the time Hannibal reached southern Italy again, he found Rome transformed. The Republic was cautious, wary, yet ever growing in strength. Hannibal had forced Rome to respect cunning, strategy, and patience. But he had also forced Rome to innovate. The shadow of Cannae lingered, a constant reminder of the power of genius, the horror of miscalculation, and the endurance of spirit. Years passed. Hannibal remained in Italy, commanding respect and fear. He won battles, yes, small victories that reminded Rome of his presence, but he could never achieve the same catastrophic triumph as at Cannae. Rome, now led by wiser generals and inspired by the lessons of blood and loss, adapted. Legions moved with greater caution. The Senate, scarred by despair, became strategic. The young Scipio, observing Hannibal closely, dreamed of a way to bring the war home, to Carthage itself. Meanwhile, Hannibal's army aged. Veterans grew weary. Recruits lacked the experience of those who had perished at Cannae. Supply lines stretched thin across hostile lands. Even a master strategist cannot conjure men from dust. The greatest victories are ephemeral. Time, disease, hunger, and fatigue are enemies no commander can escape. Cannae had been perfect, but perfection cannot last. Hannibal's genius remained undeniable. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, he had reshaped battle itself. Yet Rome endured. Each lost legion taught new leaders what not to do. Each defeat hardened the Republic's resolve. The citizens who survived Cannae carried memory and fury into every campaign. Scipio, now a young general, studied Hannibal like a scholar studies a book. Every formation, every maneuver, every subtle trick was analyzed and committed to memory. The son of Rome's pride would one day confront the Carthaginian in Africa itself. Meanwhile, Hannibal's reputation spread beyond Italy. Cities whispered his name as one whispers of gods or demons. He was a man of victory and fear, of brilliance and tragedy. Yet even he knew Rome would not collapse easily. The Republic was a living entity, learning and evolving from every wound. Time began to favor the patient. Rome rebuilt, reorganized, and rearmed. Hannibal, despite brilliance and courage, could not force the eternal city to surrender. The shadow of Cannae stretched across generations. It was a lesson, a warning, a myth. It showed the power of intellect over strength. It demonstrated the fragility of arrogance. And it revealed the unbreakable will of a nation determined to survive. Even as Hannibal aged and Rome strengthened, the memory of that fateful day lingered in every heart. Legions carried it like a scar. Commanders spoke of it in whispers and in lectures. Strategists studied it as both example and warning. Rome had been broken. Rome had been humiliated. But Rome had endured. And the world remembered Cannae not only as the bloodiest battle in Roman history, but as the turning point in the story of an empire, where genius met resilience, where arrogance met patience, and where the eternal city learned that survival is the greatest victory of all. August 24th, 410 AD. The eternal city was burning. For the first time in 8 centuries, the heart of the Roman world trembled not from the clash of armies it commanded, but from the screams of its own people. The empire that had conquered the known world now watched its own capital fall. How could it happen? How could Rome, the mistress of nations, the mother of law, the city that had ruled from Scotland to Syria, be reduced to fire and ash by a band of barbarian warriors? This is the story of that day. The day the Roman Empire died, not with the roar of legions, but with the whisper of surrender. The day the eternal city ceased to be eternal. Centuries earlier, Rome had seemed unstoppable. Her legions had broken Carthage, crushed the Greek kings, and humbled the might of Persia. Her eagles flew from the sands of Africa to the snows of Germania. But power is a fragile thing. Like marble, it cracks from within before it shatters from without. By the 5th century, the empire that once stretched across the world was a wounded giant, majestic still, but bleeding from 1,000 unseen cuts. The roads that had once carried legions now carried refugees. The treasury that had once overflowed with gold now rattled with empty promises. And the legions themselves, proud, disciplined, unstoppable, were shadows of their former glory. Rome had forgotten how to fear her enemies. And that would be her undoing. In the West, emperors rose and fell like candle flames in the wind. Between 395 and 410, no fewer than 6 emperors had worn the purple, some reigning mere months. Power was now a game of survival, not empire. The real rulers were generals, ambitious warlords commanding private armies, loyal not to Rome, but to their own fortunes. Among them was one man whose shadow loomed larger than the rest, a man whose name would echo through history like a curse and a prophecy. Half Roman, half barbarian, Stilicho had been the empire's shield for 2 decades. He was both loved and feared, a man of ruthless brilliance, holding the crumbling Western Empire together by sheer will. But even he could not hold back the tide forever. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, the world was shifting. The tribes of Germania, the Goths, Vandals, Suebi, were on the move, driven westward by an even greater terror, the Huns. Among those tribes was one led by a man whose destiny was tied to Rome's own end, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. To the Romans, he was a barbarian. To his own people, he was a liberator, a man of noble birth, trained in Roman warfare, who had once served in the Roman army itself. He had fought for Rome, bled for Rome, and been betrayed by Rome. When the empire broke its promises, withholding pay, land, and honor, Alaric turned from loyal soldier to avenging storm. His war was not one of hatred, but of justice twisted into vengeance. And his eyes were fixed on the greatest prize of all, the city of Rome itself. In 401 AD, Alaric invaded Italy for the first time. Panic swept through the peninsula as Gothic horsemen rode across the Alps. But Stilicho, Rome's last true general, met him head-on. At Pollentia and Verona, the Roman legions, blooded but unbroken, defeated Alaric, forcing him to retreat. Rome was safe, for now. Yet victory came at a cost. The treasury was drained. The provinces were restless. And the emperor, Honorius, was no Marcus Aurelius, no philosopher king, no warrior emperor. He was a frightened man, more at home with his chickens than his generals. Honorius fled Rome for the safety of Ravenna, a swamp-surrounded fortress city impossible to besiege. There, behind its walls, he would remain for the rest of his life, while Rome bled in his absence. In 408, Stilicho's enemies at court whispered poison into the emperor's ear. They accused the great general of plotting with Alaric, of treachery, of ambition. Honorius, weak, paranoid, and desperate, believed them. Stilicho was arrested. His soldiers, the last disciplined army of the West, were massacred. And the man who had saved Rome more than once was executed by his own emperor. The empire had cut off its sword hand. Now it would face the storm unarmed. When Alaric learned of Stilicho's death, he knew the moment had come. Rome was defenseless. Her legions scattered, her coffers empty, her emperor hiding in Ravenna. The Goths swept across Italy like a tide of vengeance. Cities surrendered or burned. And soon, the eternal city itself was surrounded. Inside, famine stalked the streets. Bodies piled by the Tiber. The Senate, once the proud council of the world, now begged the barbarian king for mercy. Alaric demanded gold, silver, and slaves. The Romans paid. The siege was lifted. But the price of peace only bought time. In the summer of 410, Alaric returned for the third time. The walls of Rome loomed before him, ancient, defiant, decaying. Inside, the people prayed to gods who no longer answered. On the night of August 24th, a gate was opened from within. No one knows by whom. Some said it was slaves, others said it was desperate soldiers seeking survival. But once the gate of the Salarian Gate opened, Rome's fate was sealed. The Goths poured in like a flood. For 3 days and nights, the eternal city was at their mercy. Temples burned. Palaces were looted. The cries of women and children echoed through streets once walked by emperors. And through it all rode Alaric, calm, commanding, almost mournful. He ordered his men to spare the churches, to leave those who sought refuge in sacred places unharmed. But chaos has no master. And soon, fire and blood swallowed the city whole. To the world, it was unthinkable. Rome, the city that had stood for 800 years, had fallen. Saint Jerome, far away in Bethlehem, wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." News spread like a shadow across the world. In Constantinople, men wept. In Africa, trade halted. In Britain, the last Roman soldiers simply left. It was more than a defeat. It was the death of an idea, that Rome was eternal, chosen by the gods, immune to time and fate. Now the illusion was gone. The empire had bled too long, and now the wound was mortal. And what of Honorius, the emperor of the West? When word reached him that Rome had fallen, he did not weep. According to legend, he merely asked, "But how could that be? My chicken, Roma, was just fed this morning." He was speaking of a pet bird named Roma. When told it was the city that had fallen, not the animal, the emperor sighed in relief. Whether the story is true or not, it captures the essence of the age, an emperor detached from his people, while his empire turned to dust. When the smoke cleared, the Goths marched south. Alaric did not stay to rule the city he had conquered. He was not a destroyer by nature, but a wanderer searching for a home. He wanted ships to sail to Africa, to settle his people on new lands. But fate denied him even that. Before he could depart, Alaric fell ill and died near Cosenza. His followers buried him in secret beneath a diverted river, so that none might ever disturb their king. When the waters returned to their course, all trace of the grave was lost. Alaric vanished into legend, the barbarian who broke Rome, and then disappeared beneath its soil. Rome would rise again, in name. New emperors would wear the purple. But something vital had died that August night, something that could never be reborn. The city that had ruled the world now lay humbled, its god silent, its destiny spent. For centuries, men would look back and ask, how could such greatness fall? The answer is simple. Rome was not murdered. Rome committed suicide. It was undone not by barbarians, but by its own pride, corruption, and decay. The sack of 410 was not the end. It was the beginning of the end. A whisper that became a storm, and a storm that became the silence of the Dark Ages. Before Rome burned, before the eternal city fell to the roar of northern war cries, there was a man born between two worlds, neither Roman nor barbarian. His name was Alaric, son of a chieftain, student of Rome, and the last king of the Goths. To understand the fall of Rome, one must understand him. For the story of Alaric is the story of a dream of justice, vengeance, and destiny. He was not the destroyer Rome imagined. He was the mirror she refused to look into. The Goths were a people of the forests and plains, wanderers who traced their origins to the misty lands beyond the Danube. They were not savages, as Roman writers like to say. They were warriors, poets, craftsmen, a nation without a home. For centuries, they had watched Rome's borders glitter with wealth and power. They traded with the empire, served in its armies, and admired its greatness. But admiration turned to fear when a new terror swept across the east, the Huns. Riders from the steppes, their faces scarred, their eyes burning with cruelty. They descended like locusts, crushing everything in their path. Villages burned. Rivers ran red. And the Goths, desperate and broken, fled toward the Roman frontier, begging for asylum. The Goths came to the river Danube in their tens of thousands, men, women, and children. They begged the Emperor Valens for permission to cross into Roman lands. Valens, fearing their numbers, hesitated, but greed won over caution. Roman officials saw an opportunity for profit. They agreed to let the Goths cross, for a price. The Goths handed over their weapons, their children, their dignity. But once inside Roman borders, they were left to starve. Roman governors sold them dog meat at the price of gold. Others took Gothic children as slaves. The betrayal festered like an open wound. And when the Goths rose in rebellion, it was not just hunger that drove them, it was rage. Under the blazing sun of Thrace, the Roman army met the Goths in battle. The legions marched with banners high, confident in their discipline and tradition. They had faced barbarians before and crushed them. But this time, Rome faced an enemy that had learned her secrets. The Goths fought not as scattered tribes, but as an army. And when the Roman cavalry fled, the legions were surrounded. By nightfall, the field was a graveyard. Emperor Valens himself was cut down, burned alive in a farmhouse as he tried to flee. 2/3 of his army perished. Adrianople was more than a defeat. It was a prophecy. Rome had met her future, and it had Gothic eyes. From the ashes of that victory rose a new generation of warriors. Among them, a young man watched and learned, Alaric. He had seen what Rome could do to his people. He had seen betrayal, starvation, and false promises. But he also saw something else, Rome's greatness, her discipline, her order, her power. Alaric would not seek to destroy it, not at first. He wanted to belong to it, to take his place in the empire that had both enslaved and inspired his race. In his youth, he served in the Roman army under the great general Stilicho. He marched beneath the eagles. He fought against the empire's enemies, the Huns, the Vandals, the Persians. But the Romans never saw him as one of their own. To them, he was always the barbarian, the outsider, the tool. And when his men went unpaid, when honors were denied, the mask of loyalty cracked. Alaric turned away from Rome, and the empire's greatest student became its greatest threat. In 395, the Emperor Theodosius, the last ruler of a united empire, died. The empire was split between his two sons, Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east. They were boys, weak, inexperienced, and surrounded by vultures. Power fell into the hands of generals, and in the chaos that followed, Alaric saw his moment. He gathered his warriors, Visigoths hardened by decades of exile, and declared himself king. No longer mercenaries, no longer servants, now a people reborn. He marched into Greece, ravaging the provinces that had once enslaved his ancestors. Athens, Corinth, Sparta, all bowed before him. But Alaric did not burn them all. He was no Attila. He sought recognition, not ruin. He wanted a Roman title, a Roman command, to be made Magister Militum, a general of Rome. But the Eastern court refused. To them, he was still a barbarian thief. Rejected again, Alaric turned west, toward Italy and the heart of the empire. In 401, the Gothic king crossed the Alps. Snow fell over his army as they descended into the fertile plains of northern Italy. Behind them came wagons filled with families, the Gothic nation itself on the move. The Romans were unprepared. Cities fell. The Senate panicked. For the first time since Hannibal, the enemy was in Italy. But standing between Alaric and the Eternal City was Stilicho. Once comrades, now enemies. The half-barbarian general faced the full-blooded king. At Pollentia, on Easter Day, 402, their armies clashed. The battle raged from dawn to dusk. Thousands fell. Horses screamed. Shields broke. When it ended, the Goths retreated, but not defeated. Stilicho had won the field, but not the war. He allowed Alaric to withdraw, and even later made a secret alliance with him. For Stilicho knew what the emperor did not, that the Goths could not be destroyed. They could only be bought, or starved, or turned against Rome's enemies. But Rome's politics would make that impossible. In 408, after years of fragile peace, paranoia took hold in the imperial court. Roman senators accused Stilicho of conspiring with Alaric to seize the throne. Honorius believed them. The general who had saved the empire was executed. His army disbanded. His family hunted. When the news reached Alaric, he understood. The shield of Rome was gone. The gates were open. He gathered his warriors again and marched for the city that had defied the world. As his army moved south, Alaric spoke to his warriors. "We have served them, fought for them, and they repay us with chains. Now we shall claim what we are owed." But those words were not shouted in rage. They were spoken with the calm of inevitability. For Alaric was no savage. He wore Roman armor, read Roman strategy, spoke Latin as fluently as any senator. He was the ghost of Rome's past, the reflection of everything she had created and everything she had forgotten. A Roman enemy built in Rome's own image. His men called him the Ghost King. For he seemed to move between worlds, neither pagan nor Christian, neither conqueror nor savior. He would enter Rome not as an invader, but as judgment made flesh. When Alaric's army encircled Rome, the citizens refused to believe it. They had not seen an enemy at their gate since Hannibal, 600 years before. The city of marble trembled as the Gothic drums began to beat. Inside, panic spread. The Senate met in secret. The pagan priests performed sacrifices once banned by law. The Christians prayed for deliverance. But no army came. The emperor remained in Ravenna, safe behind his swamps and walls. When famine struck, the Romans sent envoys to negotiate. Alaric demanded 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and thousands of slaves. The Senate gasped. One senator, proud and foolish, asked, "If we give you all this, what will be left to us?" Alaric replied, "Your lives." They paid. The siege was lifted. But Rome's humiliation was complete. The Eternal City had ransomed itself to a barbarian king. Peace was brief. Rome broke its promises once again. The payments stopped. The negotiations turned to insults. Alaric's patience, stretched across decades, finally snapped. He returned in 410 with vengeance, and this time there would be no gold, no treaties, no mercy. On the night of August 24th, the Salarian Gate opened. The Visigoths entered the city like a storm, and for 3 days, the Eternal City burned. Alaric rode through the chaos in silence. He forbade his men to harm those in churches. He spared St. Peter's and St. Paul's. Even in conquest, he showed restraint, a conqueror with the soul of a philosopher. When the fires died, he ordered his army to march south. He had no desire to rule over ruins. But fate had other plans. As his army reached the coast, Alaric prepared ships to sail to Africa. There, he dreamed of building a Gothic kingdom, a new home for his people. But before the journey began, he fell ill. His warriors, loyal to the end, diverted a river to bury him in its bed. They laid him to rest beneath the flowing water, surrounded by the treasures of Rome. When the river was returned to its course, every man who had helped in the burial was slain, so none would ever find the grave. Thus ended the life of Alaric, king of the Goths, scourge of Rome, the man who ended an age. He did not live to see what his victory unleashed, a world without Rome, a world where the light of civilization flickered and nearly died. In the centuries to come, monks would copy his name in trembling script, historians would curse him as the barbarian who broke the world, and poets would mourn him as the instrument of fate. But perhaps, if Alaric could speak, he would say this: "I did not destroy Rome. I only knocked on her door and found it already hollow." He was not the end of civilization. He was its reckoning. The empire had built its walls of stone, but forgotten that empires are made of people. And people, when betrayed long enough, become storms. It began with silence. The kind of silence that hangs heavy before a storm. A silence thick with fear, memory, and the weight of centuries. August 24th, 410 AD. The moon hung pale above the 7 hills of Rome. The city slept uneasily, guarded by walls that had stood unbroken for 800 years. But that night, the walls did not save her. That night, the eternal city, the mistress of the world, became a widow to her own glory. 4 generations, Romans had believed their city untouchable. Even as the empire's borders shrank, even as barbarians ravaged the provinces, they told themselves one truth: Rome would stand forever. But eternity is a fragile illusion. And as the gates of the Salarian Gate opened, whether by treachery, desperation, or divine will, eternity ended. Through that single breach, thousands of Gothic warriors surged into the sleeping city. The sound came first, the shattering of iron, the screams of sentries, the pounding of boots on marble streets. Then came the light, torches flaring against the black sky, reflecting off the domes of temples and palaces. Rome, the eternal city, was awake and burning. Imagine it. A city of 1,000,000 souls, once the center of the known world, now trapped in chaos. The narrow streets that had seen triumphal parades and imperial processions now filled with fire and blood. The marble pillars of the Forum glowed red as flames licked across their bases. The air thickened with smoke, screams, and the collapse of roofs. Everywhere, people ran. Senators, slaves, priests, children, all equal in terror. Gold and titles no longer mattered. Only survival did. And above it all, the sound of Gothic horns echoed, deep, ancient, and merciless. They did not sound like victory. They sounded like judgment. The sack of Rome was not a single act of destruction. It was 3 days of reckoning, 3 nights when civilization itself trembled. On the first night, fire consumed the city's heart. Temples burned, not just to the old gods, but to memory itself. The temple of Jupiter, the greatest of them all, stood like a blackened skeleton against the firestorm. The Senate House, once the cradle of empire, echoed with footsteps of men who spoke no Latin. The Visigoths looted treasures older than their own nation, gold carried from the east, statues carved by Greek masters, scrolls written by philosophers long dead. But to them, it was not sacrilege. It was justice delayed. For centuries, Rome had taken from the world. Now the world took from Rome. On the second day, the fire spread beyond control. The Tiber River ran black with ash. Smoke rose so high it blotted out the sun, turning noon into twilight. Crows circled the city's edges, feasting on what was left behind. Within the ruins, chaos turned to horror. Families hid in cellars, whispering prayers to gods who no longer listened. The cries of the dying mingled with the crash of collapsing domes. The smell, a mixture of burning wood, oil, and flesh, hung over the city like a curse. Once, Roman generals had burned cities like this. Now Rome was tasting its own medicine. The empire that had called itself eternal was learning how quickly eternity burns. On the third day, silence began to return. The fires had consumed most of what they could. What remained was plunder, gold melted into lumps, jewels torn from temples, slaves herded together like cattle. The Goths moved through the ruins methodically, stripping away what wealth they could carry. But not all was cruelty. Alaric had ordered that churches be spared. And so, amidst the chaos, islands of peace remained, sanctuaries where the desperate huddled under the shadow of the cross. Within those sacred walls, the old Rome and the new briefly met. Pagans who had mocked the Christians now begged them for refuge. The persecuted became the protectors. And for a moment, in that sea of fire, faith became stronger than empire. But outside, the city was unrecognizable. The grand avenues of the Palatine and Aventine hills were carpeted with corpses. Marble statues lay shattered in the dust, emperors, gods, and heroes broken alike. The Colosseum, once a symbol of Roman pride, stood untouched, silent, a ghostly monument to spectacle and cruelty. The Roman Forum, where senators once debated the fate of nations, was now a graveyard of smoke and rubble. The proud columns of Trajan's market rose like bones from the ashes. The Pantheon's dome, that great eye of Roman architecture, still stood, blackened but unbowed, staring into the smoke-filled heavens as if asking the gods why they had abandoned their city. The gods, however, were silent. Those who survived wandered the streets in disbelief. Some tried to salvage what they could. Others simply sat in the ruins, staring blankly at the remains of their lives. An old senator was found weeping beside the broken statue of Augustus. He did not cry for the loss of gold or power, but for the loss of meaning. For in that moment, he realized that Rome, the idea of Rome, had died. And yet, even amid the devastation, life persisted. Children were born that night. The Tiber still flowed. Some fires burned out, others smoldered quietly, sending embers into the dawn. The world had ended, and yet, it had not. For history does not stop when empires fall. It simply changes its name. To those who watched from afar, the news was unthinkable. In Constantinople, people fainted in the streets when the word arrived. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, could only say, "My voice sticks in my throat. The city that took the whole world has itself been taken." In North Africa, merchants halted their ships. In Gaul, soldiers deserted their posts. In Britain, cut off and leaderless, the last Roman garrisons vanished. The empire's fabric, stretched thin across continents, finally tore. The fall of Rome was not just the fall of a city. It was the collapse of a world order, a world that had believed itself divine, destined, unshakable. And when that illusion fell, it left behind a vacuum that would swallow centuries. The Visigoths did not stay. They left the city carrying wagons of gold, silver, and relics. Among them, legend says, was the great menorah from Jerusalem, looted centuries before by Titus. Perhaps it was lost in the fire, perhaps carried away into the mists of history. No one knows. Alaric's men moved south, weary and silent. They had won everything, and yet they looked upon Rome's ruins and found no joy. They were wanderers again, burdened not with spoils, but with the weight of what they had done. For even the victors of history must live with its ghosts. In the ashes of Rome, the survivors began to rebuild. They cleaned the streets, buried the dead, prayed for rain to wash away the smoke. But something in the Roman spirit had broken. They no longer believed in their own eternity. The illusion of invincibility, the myth of divine protection, was gone forever. The Senate met again, fewer now, older, quieter. They spoke not of conquest, but of survival. They sent envoys to the emperor in Ravenna, begging for help, for leadership, for anything that might restore their dignity. But Honorius did not come. He remained behind his marshes, safe from the world he had failed to protect. And in that absence, a new reality began to take root. The empire no longer protected Rome. Rome was alone. The city recovered, in time. The walls were repaired, the markets reopened. Children played once more in the Forum, their laughter echoing where once swords had clashed. But the soul of Rome, the Rome of Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, never returned. The empire still called itself Roman, still minted coins, still crowned emperors. But those were ghosts wearing imperial robes. The West had died that August, even if it did not yet know it. In the centuries to come, new kingdoms would rise on Rome's corpse: the Franks, the Goths, the Lombards. They would build cathedrals where temples once stood, raise kings where emperors once ruled, and write their own stories in the language of their conqueror. The barbarians had not just destroyed Rome, they had inherited it. And yet, for all its ruin, Rome never truly disappeared. Her roads still shaped Europe. Her laws guided nations. Her language became the mother of tongues. Even in death, the empire whispered. The sack of 410 was not the end of civilization. It was its rebirth, painful, bloody, uncertain, like iron reforged in fire. But to those who lived through it, it was nothing less than the apocalypse. The city that had ruled for 1,000 years was humbled in 3 nights. The empire that had enslaved the world could not save itself. And when the smoke cleared, the world stood at the edge of something new, a dawn that would later be called the Dark. When historians look back, they see empires as lines on maps. They see the fall of Rome as a date, a moment, an event. But for those who stood in that burning city, it was not history. It was heartbreak. The end of Rome was not one fall, but 1,000 small betrayals. Of duty, of faith, of unity, of compassion. It was the story of a people who forgot what had made them great and remembered it only when the fires came. So when you hear the words, the fall of Rome, do not think only of Alaric, or legions, or gold. Think of the silence that followed. Think of the people staring at a sky choked with ash, realizing that the world they had known was gone. That silence was the true sound of Rome's fall. A silence that still echoes, faintly, in every city that believes itself eternal. The smoke lingered over Rome for days. It clung to the marble columns like a ghost refusing to leave the mortal world. When the Goths finally marched away, the eternal city was silent, broken statues, hollow temples, and streets filled with ashes. And somewhere, in that silence, the Roman Empire died, not with a final breath, but with a whisper. For 800 years, Rome had stood unchallenged. Its legions had conquered the world, its laws had shaped civilizations, and its name alone had once made kings tremble. But on August 24th, 410 AD, all that remained was smoke and memory. The sack of Rome was not just the fall of a city. It was the shattering of an illusion, the realization that even eternity can crumble. Saint Jerome, far away in Bethlehem, wrote with trembling hands, "The city which had taken the whole world is itself taken." And indeed, it was not just walls that had fallen. It was faith, the faith that Rome could never die. In the months that followed, refugees poured into the countryside, senators, priests, and peasants alike, walking the same dusty roads that their ancestors had once built. Some carried relics. Others carried nothing but the stories of what they had seen. The Tiber ran dark with ash and blood. The aqueducts no longer sang their songs of water. The amphitheater was silent. Alaric, the man who had brought Rome to its knees, would not live much longer. On his march south, death found him suddenly. Fever, exhaustion, perhaps poison. Legend says he was buried beneath a riverbed, surrounded by treasure, the waters diverted and then returned to their course, to hide forever the man who ended the eternal city. The Goths moved on, restless, carrying with them the ghost of the empire they had slain. And Rome remained, wounded, humiliated, yet still breathing. The news of the fall spread across the Mediterranean like wildfire. In Constantinople, the Eastern Emperor wept. In Alexandria, traders whispered that the end of the world had come. In the wild north, barbarian tribes celebrated. The wolf had finally devoured the lion. But time, as always, was patient. Rome did not vanish overnight. The Senate still met, emperors still ruled in name, the sun still rose over the ruins. Yet something irreversible had happened. The soul of Rome, the idea that had held the world together, was gone. No longer did people believe in the Pax Romana, in the unbroken might of the eagle. Now they believed in survival, in faith, in the kingdoms rising from the wreckage. The Western Empire would stagger on for another 66 years, a corpse still walking. But its heart had stopped beating in 410. Centuries later, when scholars look back, they would argue endlessly about when Rome truly fell. Was it when the last emperor was deposed in 476? When the legions left Britain? Or when the eternal city was first plundered by its own former soldiers, men who once called themselves Romans? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the date, but in the silence that followed. For after 410, the world no longer looked to Rome for salvation. The torch had passed, not to another empire, but to the chaos of the Dark Ages. Yet, even in ruin, Rome refused to vanish. Its roads still shaped Europe. Its language survived in whispers, in Latin prayers, in the tongues of scholars. Its laws became the skeleton of nations. Its memory became a dream too powerful to die. And so, in the ashes of its own destruction, Rome planted the seeds of its rebirth. Every empire that came after, the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the Franks, even the modern world, would chase the ghost of Rome. Because Rome was not just a city. It was an idea, and ideas, unlike marble or gold, do not burn. The sack of 410 was a tragedy, but also a revelation. It stripped away the illusion of invincibility and revealed what lay beneath, a humanity both fragile and defiant. When Alaric's men left, they did not just take treasures. They took Rome's innocence. The eternal city had become mortal. And perhaps that was Rome's final gift to the world, the lesson that even the greatest power must one day fall. That pride, wealth, and conquest are fleeting. That empires, like men, are born to die. But what endures is memory. The whisper of marble under dust, the echo of footsteps in abandoned forums, the glint of sunlight on a broken Aquila standard. And through it all, the voice of history, murmuring softly. All empires fall, but Rome never truly dies. Rome, on the edge of annihilation. The year is 378 AD. The mighty Roman Empire, once thought eternal, now trembles before a threat that no legion has faced in living memory. Beyond the Danube, a people long misunderstood and underestimated gather, the Goths, refugees, and warriors, driven not just by survival, but by vengeance. They march under the leadership of Fritigern, a cunning chieftain whose name history will remember for both brilliance and ruthlessness. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Emperor, Valens, sits in his imperial court. He is confident, perhaps overly so. Reports have reached him. The Goths have crossed the river, seeking asylum, fleeing the Huns. But Valens sees not desperation, but opportunity. Opportunity to display Roman might, to assert dominance, and to carve his own name into the annals of history. Advisors caution him. Wait for reinforcements, they urge. Do not underestimate them. Their numbers are vast, and their resolve is unmatched. Valens, proud and determined, dismisses these warnings. He believes his legions, battle-hardened, disciplined, and well-armed, are sufficient. Glory awaits him on the plains of Adrianople, and he will not hesitate. Across the land, the Goths prepare with meticulous care. The Tervings and Greuthungs, two Gothic factions, unite under Fritigern's command. They know the terrain intimately, every marsh, every ridge, every potential ambush point. Unlike the Romans, their strength lies not in rigid formations, but in adaptability, patience, and the fierce will to survive. Archers are stationed on hidden rises, cavalry patrols scout relentlessly, and signals flare across the plain to communicate movements. The Goths are not untrained barbarians. They are tacticians, masters of deception, and observers of Roman behavior. They will not strike blindly. They will strike when the moment is right, and when the Romans are most vulnerable. The Roman march begins. Thousands of soldiers trudge across the fields, their armor shining under the harsh summer sun. Banners flutter proudly in the wind. The legions are confident, each man believing that victory is a certainty. Yet, confidence can be a dangerous weapon. It blinds, it slows the perception of danger, and it lulls even the strongest into fatal mistakes. Valens has chosen haste over caution. He refuses to wait for the Western legions, believing speed will surprise the Goths and prevent them from organizing fully. But Fritigern anticipates every move. Reports from scouts flow in like water, precise and detailed. He knows when the Romans will camp, when they will march, and where their weaknesses lie. He waits, silent and patient, knowing that Rome's own arrogance will do half his work for him. As the two forces draw closer, the air grows tense. The distant sound of hooves pounding the earth, the glint of weapons under the sun, and the murmurs of soldiers combine to form a symphony of impending violence. Neither side has yet seen the other fully, but both feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon them. When the battle finally erupts, it is chaos incarnate. Roman formations, so carefully drilled and practiced, falter under the unrelenting pressure of Gothic archers. Arrows blot out the sun, striking men and horses alike. Cavalry swoops from the flanks, cutting through supply lines and striking at the rear. Panic spreads like wildfire. Shields clash, swords bite, and screams echo across the plains. The battlefield, once orderly and structured, becomes a landscape of confusion, blood, and fire. Valens, amidst the turmoil, fails to recognize the full extent of the Gothic cunning. Reinforcements are delayed, and coordination breaks down. The disciplined Roman legions, famed for centuries as the most formidable army in the known world, struggle to maintain cohesion. Chaos reigns, and the Goths, patient and precise, exploit every flaw. By the time the sun reaches its zenith, the battle has already decided itself. The Gothic cavalry encircles the Romans. Archers continue their relentless barrage. Men fall by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Horses scream, shields shatter, and the once mighty army of Rome crumbles into a scene of slaughter and despair. Emperor Valens himself disappears into the chaos. Some say he fought valiantly to the end, sword in hand, refusing to surrender. Others whisper that he perished without warning, consumed by the storm of arrows and steel. The precise details are lost to history, but the outcome is clear. Rome, the eternal city, suffers a devastating blow. The Battle of Adrianople is more than a clash of armies. It is a turning point in history. The Gothic victory demonstrates that even the mightiest empire is not invincible. It foreshadows a slow unraveling, a weakening of borders, a realization that Rome's power is not absolute. Refugees will continue to settle within imperial lands, new threats will rise, and the empire will struggle to maintain control over territories that once seemed secure. History remembers Adrianople as a lesson in hubris, strategy, and the unpredictable nature of war. It is a testament to the cunning of those often dismissed as barbarians, and a stark reminder that even the strongest can fall when pride blinds judgment. In the aftermath, the landscape is unrecognizable. Fields once filled with banners and soldiers now lie strewn with the dead, horses and men alike. Fires burn in villages caught between armies. Survivors recount stories of valor and terror, of friends lost in moments of panic, of moments of heroism that rise briefly before being extinguished by the merciless tide of battle. Adrianople will echo through time as a warning. Greatness is fragile, and even the strongest are mortal. The morning sun casts long shadows across the plains of Adrianople, illuminating a landscape soon to be drenched in blood. Roman legions march in disciplined columns, their banners snapping sharply in the breeze, their armor glinting as if reflecting the arrogance of centuries. Each step echoes the confidence that Rome has instilled in its soldiers for generations. But confidence, like steel, can be shattered. The Goths lie in wait, hidden among the folds of the rolling terrain. Fritigern, aware of the Roman eagerness, positions his forces with precision. Archers occupy high ground, behind ridges and small knolls, invisible until the moment of attack. Cavalry is poised on the flanks, ready to encircle. Infantry, shielded by natural obstacles, awaits the signal. Every man, every horse, every weapon is placed with an understanding of how Rome will act, and how Rome will inevitably overreach. The first clash is deceptively quiet. Roman scouts report no immediate threat, the Goths seemingly retreating. Valens, interpreting this as hesitation, orders his forces forward. The legions advance in tight formations, shields locked, spears poised, marching confidently toward what they believe is a weakened enemy. Then, without warning, the sky darkens with the volley of arrows. Archers emerge from their hidden positions, their precision deadly. Roman soldiers, unprepared for such an onslaught, falter. Shields are pierced. Horses scream as arrows strike their mounts, causing chaos in the ranks. Panic spreads, and formations begin to crumble. Fritigern's cavalry strikes from the flanks. Swift, disciplined, and merciless, they cut through supply lines, slicing at the rearguards and sowing disorder. Horses thunder across the battlefield, their hooves shattering the order Rome relies upon. Cavalrymen wield spears and swords with practiced ease, turning what was meant to be a linear march into a chaotic storm of violence. The infantry in the Roman center fights valiantly. They form defensive circles, attempting to hold the line against a relentless barrage. Soldiers shout orders, attempting to rally their comrades, but confusion reigns. Arrows pierce shields and armor alike. Spears clash. The screams of the wounded and dying mingle with the roar of battle. Each man fights not just for glory, but for survival. Amidst the chaos, Valens rides among his men. His presence is meant to inspire courage, to restore order. Yet the battlefield is a place where even emperors cannot command destiny. Horses are struck down beneath him, and soldiers around him fall, leaving gaps in the once unbroken lines. The Goths exploit every weakness. Archers reposition, cavalry charges again and again, and infantry strikes wherever resistance falters. Roman generals attempt to coordinate counterattacks, but communication breaks down. The noise, the smoke, the sheer scale of the engagement render traditional commands nearly impossible. Messages sent by runners are intercepted or fail to arrive. Misunderstandings spread. Some units, believing they are isolated, retreat in disorder, only to collide with friendly forces moving in different directions. The battlefield becomes a maze of panic, confusion, and blood. In the rear, Roman baggage trains are overrun. Supplies are seized, fires erupt, and fleeing soldiers clog paths of escape. The Goth strategy is meticulous. They cut off avenues of retreat while maintaining pressure on the front lines. Every Roman misstep is exploited. Every hesitation is punished. Amid the tumult, individual acts of heroism emerge. A centurion rallies his men to hold a small hill, fending off repeated Gothic charges. A young recruit, barely trained, defends a wounded comrade, standing firm despite the onslaught. Yet these moments, while noble, are islands in a sea of devastation. The overwhelming force of the Gothic tactics cannot be contained by bravery alone. Hours pass, though time seems distorted amidst the chaos. The sun climbs higher, scorching the sweat-soaked soldiers. Roman formations are fragmented, morale deteriorates, and exhaustion sets in. The Goths, patient and unyielding, continue their encirclement. Cavalry sweeps around to cut off the retreat, archers harass any movement, and infantry pushes relentlessly forward. Valens himself disappears into the melee. Contemporary accounts differ. Some claim he fought valiantly to the last, refusing to flee. Others suggest he perished early, overwhelmed by the storm of enemies. Regardless, his death seals the fate of his army. Without leadership, coordination collapses entirely. The once mighty Roman legions are routed. Survivors flee, pursued mercilessly by Gothic cavalry. The plains of Adrianople are strewn with bodies of men and horses alike, banners trampled in the mud, armor shattered, the echoes of battle lingering like a ghost over the land. The victory of the Goths is not simply military. It is psychological, a demonstration that even Rome, the eternal power, can be challenged and defeated. The repercussions ripple through the empire. News of the defeat spreads rapidly. Cities tremble. Borders feel suddenly fragile. A generation of soldiers is lost, and with them, the aura of invincibility that Rome had long projected. In the days following the battle, the battlefield remains a grim tableau. Fires smolder in abandoned camps. Survivors wander aimlessly, traumatized, searching for comrades, food, and water. Bodies are hastily buried or left exposed to the elements. The land itself seems to mourn the slaughter. Historians later mark Adrianople as a turning point. The empire will survive in name, but its military dominance is broken. The Gothic settlement within Roman territory foreshadows the gradual fragmentation of the Western Empire. Rome learns that overconfidence, arrogance, and underestimating one's enemy can have catastrophic consequences. Adrianople is remembered not just as a battle, but as a warning etched into the chronicles of history. No empire, however mighty, is immune to the consequences of hubris. The clash of 378 AD resonates through centuries, shaping strategies, inspiring caution, and reminding all who study it that the tides of war are unpredictable, and that the line between victory and annihilation is thinner than the edge of a sword. The aftermath of Adrianople is a scene of devastation and disbelief. The Roman Empire, once confident in its might, now confronts a reality it had long refused to acknowledge. Rome is not invincible. Across the empire, reports filter in from cities and garrisons, each recounting the same grim story: massive losses, shattered morale, and an enemy emboldened by victory. In Constantinople, the eastern capital, the court is thrown into turmoil. Advisors and generals debate the next move, but consensus is impossible. Panic mixes with political opportunism, and rumors swirl about who is to blame for the catastrophe. Some point fingers at Valens himself, claiming his overconfidence led directly to disaster. Others suggest that the generals on the ground failed to implement strategies properly, while a few whisper of treachery or miscommunication. In truth, it is a combination of all: human error, arrogance, and the unpredictable genius of the Goths. Meanwhile, the Goths consolidate their gains. Fritigern, now celebrated among his people, secures territories within the empire and negotiates settlements that will grant his people a precarious foothold in Roman lands. For the Goths, the victory is not merely military, it is existential. They have survived centuries of persecution, displacement, and the constant pressure of invading forces. Adrianople is their moment of triumph, a vindication of resilience and strategy. Back in the Roman world, the political ramifications are severe. The death of Emperor Valens leaves a vacuum of power, raising questions about succession and governance. Officials debate whether to pursue punitive campaigns against the Goths or to negotiate peace and resettlement. The empire is forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Its borders are vulnerable, its military resources strained, and its authority increasingly questioned by both internal factions and external enemies. Soldiers who survived the slaughter return to cities and forts across the empire, haunted by what they witnessed. Their stories paint a vivid picture of the battlefield: comrades falling beside them, horses trampled, arrows raining like deadly hail. Some recount acts of bravery and sacrifice that will be immortalized in Roman annals, though often overshadowed by the sheer scale of defeat. Others tell of sheer terror, units breaking under pressure, commanders falling, and the relentless advance of Gothic forces that seemed unstoppable. Historians later describe Adrianople as a turning point in Roman military history. The battle exposes the vulnerabilities of even the most disciplined army when confronted with an adaptable and determined enemy. It challenges the traditional Roman reliance on heavy infantry formations and rigid strategies, emphasizing the need for flexibility, reconnaissance, and respect for one's opponent. Generals and scholars in the centuries that follow study Adrianople not merely as a defeat, but as a case study in the dangers of hubris and underestimation. The social and cultural consequences ripple as well. Within the empire, fear spreads among populations near the Danube frontier. Refugees and Goths now settle in Roman territory, altering local economies, demographics, and social structures. Cities that once felt secure must adapt to the presence of these newcomers, sometimes integrating them, sometimes facing sporadic conflicts. Over time, the settlement of Gothic populations within Roman lands will have profound effects on the political landscape, influencing alliances, rebellions, and the eventual fragmentation of the Western Empire. Adrianople also leaves a psychological scar. For centuries, Romans had believed in the invincibility of their legions and the sanctity of imperial command. The realization that even the emperor himself could perish on the battlefield shatters this illusion. Stories of Adrianople circulate in literature, oral tradition, and imperial records, serving both as cautionary tales and as a reminder that victory is never guaranteed, regardless of numbers, training, or reputation. In the Gothic world, Adrianople becomes a symbol of possibility. It demonstrates that organized, disciplined, and strategically minded forces can challenge the mightiest empires. For Fritigern and his warriors, the battle legitimizes their leadership and secures a place in history. Their victory challenges the stereotypes and prejudices held by Romans, showing that intelligence, adaptability, and unity can triumph over raw power. As decades pass, historians and chroniclers analyze Adrianople from multiple perspectives. Military theorists emphasize lessons in strategy and tactics, the dangers of underestimating the terrain, the importance of reconnaissance, and the necessity of adapting formations in real time. Political analysts study the collapse of leadership structures, noting how central authority can be destabilized by a single, catastrophic event. Sociologists examine the integration of Gothic populations, the shifting demographics, and the cultural exchanges that emerge from conquest and settlement. Yet amidst all this analysis, the human stories remain vivid. Soldiers who survive tell of comrades they lost, of desperate last stands, of fleeting acts of courage and humanity amid chaos. Families mourn the dead, while communities struggle to rebuild. Cities near Adrianople bear the scars for years, both physically and emotionally, as the echoes of battle reverberate across the empire. Adrianople is remembered not just as a defeat, but as a lesson etched in history, that arrogance blinds judgment, that even the strongest can fall, and that resilience, strategy, and unity can overcome overwhelming odds. It marks the beginning of a transformation in Roman military doctrine and imperial politics, a slow, painful recognition that the world was changing, and that the old ways of empire could no longer guarantee security or dominance. The plains of Adrianople, once alive with the clash of swords, now lie silent, save for the wind whispering through the grass and the distant calls of birds returning to a scarred land. Yet the memory of the battle endures. Soldiers, emperors, and chieftains all become part of a story that will be told for centuries. A story of pride, folly, courage, and the inexorable march of history. Adrianople is not merely a chapter in the history of Rome. It is a mirror held up to the impermanence of power, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and that every victory carries within it the seeds of future reckoning. The battle resonates far beyond the Danube frontier, influencing generations of leaders, generals, and historians, shaping military thought and the course of empires for centuries to come.